Something happened in the last hours of this crisis that should make every American stop and look twice. The world was told a ceasefire had arrived, but the machinery of war never truly powered down. The bombs paused, the statements changed, the headlines softened, yet the pressure points that could drag the region back into fire are still fully loaded. And that is the real story, not the relief people felt, but the danger they may be underestimating. Before we go further, subscribe to the channel and support the work. It helps us keep building sharp, serious reporting that cuts through noise and gets to the real structure underneath the headlines. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. Let's be honest from the first sentence, this ceasefire did not end the crisis. It stopped a cliff fall. That is not the same thing. The United States and Iran agreed to a 2-week pause only after the confrontation had already reached the edge of something much larger, much more expensive, and much more dangerous. President Donald Trump had pushed the confrontation to the point of open apocalyptic language. Iran had already demonstrated that it could turn geography into leverage. The Strait of Hormuz had become more than a shipping lane. It had become a pressure valve on the global economy. Oil, insurance, freight, political stability, inflation expectations, all of it was suddenly tied to one narrow corridor of water and one rapidly hardening crisis. That is why this ceasefire matters, but also why it must not be romanticized. Peace did not break out. Cost did. In political and economic terms, this pause looks less like reconciliation and more like mutual recognition of danger. Trump did not step back because the moral case for restraint finally moved him. He stepped back because the strategic bill was arriving fast. Rising oil prices were threatening to spread through the American economy. Voters were already uneasy. The risk of a prolonged regional war was no longer theoretical. It was beginning to move through markets, through household anxiety, through the political bloodstream of a country heading toward another hard electoral season. Iran also did not move because it had been politically broken. Tehran moved because it still has assets to defend and leverage to preserve. A state that can disrupt a global energy choke point does not negotiate like a defeated power. It negotiates like a power trying to convert chaos into bargaining strength. This is what too many headlines miss. In modern conflicts, the battlefield is not just where missiles land. It is where systems begin to crack. Energy systems. Trade systems. Alliance systems. Political systems. When those systems start shaking all at once, a ceasefire becomes less a peace agreement than an emergency brake. And look carefully at what Washington itself is saying. The military posture remains in place. The language of enforcement remains in place. The threat capacity remains in place. That tells you everything. This is not a settled order. It is an armed pause under unresolved terms. So yes, the world stepped back from disaster. But it did not step into peace. The fire was not put out. It was contained at the edge of the fuel line. And if the next moves on Hormuz, Lebanon, sanctions, or uranium go wrong, this ceasefire will be remembered for what it really was, not the end of the crisis, but the moment the crisis took a breath before deciding whether to explode again. What exactly is in Iran's 10-point peace plan? To understand Iran's 10-point peace plan, Americans have to stop reading it like a goodwill gesture and start reading it like what it really is, a power document written by a state that believes it still holds leverage over the board. This was not drafted as a soft diplomatic appeal. It was drafted as a strategic invoice. Tehran was not simply saying, "Here is how peace can begin." Tehran was saying, here is the price of stopping the pressure, and here is the structure of the order we want on the other side of this crisis. That distinction matters because every point in the plan is about more than the words on the page. Take the demand to lift all primary and secondary sanctions. In Washington, sanctions are often treated as punishment tools, as if they are only about moral censure or political signaling. But in the real world of state power, sanctions are financial warfare. They choke capital, narrow trade channels, freeze investment, drain public capacity, and slowly weaken a government's room to maneuver. So when Iran demands sanctions relief, it is not asking for symbolic mercy. It is demanding the restoration of economic oxygen. The same is true of frozen Iranian assets. Those assets are not just numbers trapped in foreign accounts. They represent liquidity, and liquidity is survival. It is reconstruction money. It is fiscal breathing room. It is the ability to stabilize internal patronage networks, calm domestic pressure, and re-enter regional competition with more tools in hand. In political economy, cash is not neutral. Cash is regime resilience. Tehran knows that, which is why asset release sits so high in its demands. Then comes the most explosive element in the framework: continued Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz. This is where the plan stops looking like a ceasefire paper and starts looking like a bid to rewrite regional power geometry. Hormuz is not just a narrow waterway. It is one of the world's most important energy choke points. Influence over Hormuz means influence over shipping risk. Influence over shipping risk means influence over oil pricing, insurance costs, freight flows, and the broader psychology of global markets. In plain language, Iran is trying to transform disruption into recognized authority. The demand for U.S. military withdrawal from the Middle East pushes the same logic even further. That is not a side request. That is a direct challenge to the architecture of American power in the region. Tehran is not just asking for fewer threats. It is asking for a strategic rollback of Washington's forward presence. That tells you how ambitious this plan really is. It is not about ending one exchange of fire. It is about redefining who gets to shape the post-crisis balance. The demand to end attacks on Iran and its allies is equally important. That line is Tehran's way of linking the state to its wider regional network. It is saying, in effect, that Iran's security cannot be separated from the security of the forces aligned with it. That makes the plan broader, harder, and more politically loaded than a simple bilateral truce. And that is the key point Americans need to understand. This 10-point plan is not a final peace map. It is a maximalist opening position. It is Iran setting the outer edge of the bargaining field before serious negotiation begins. Tehran is using the language of peace, but the structure of the document is all about leverage, sovereignty, money, deterrence, and long-term advantage. This is not the blueprint of a settled compromise. It is the first hard bid in a much larger struggle over who pays, who retreats, who controls the choke points, and who writes the rules after the guns go quiet. The missing phrase that changes everything: acceptance of enrichment. There are moments in diplomacy when a single missing phrase tells you more than 10 official statements ever could. This is one of those moments. In the Farsi version of Iran's reported peace plan, the phrase, acceptance of enrichment, appeared. In the English version circulated to journalists, it did not. That is not a translation footnote. That is not clerical noise. That is the pressure point inside the pressure point. Because when a term this central appears in one language and disappears in another, we are no longer just looking at negotiation. We are looking at narrative warfare. Americans need to understand what uranium enrichment means in the real structure of this conflict. It is not just a technical process. It is not just about centrifuges spinning in underground facilities. Enrichment is power. It is leverage. It is the thin line between a civilian nuclear claim and a strategic deterrent posture. For Iran, the right to enrich is wrapped in sovereignty, national pride, and the refusal to let outside powers dictate the limits of Iranian science and statehood. For the United States, and especially for President Donald Trump, it is the point where diplomacy runs into credibility. If Washington is seen as recognizing enrichment after all of this pressure, then the White House risks looking as though it turned war into concession. That is why this missing phrase matters so much. It reveals that Tehran and Washington may not just be disputing terms. They may be selling two different realities at the same time. Iran has every reason to tell its domestic audience that it did not bend on a core sovereign principle. The regime cannot afford to look like it fought, bled, absorbed pressure, and then came out the other side with less than the right to continue its nuclear path on its own terms. Trump, on the other hand, has every reason to tell the American public the exact opposite. He needs to project force, clarity, and control. He needs to say that the United States did not threaten, mobilize, and squeeze global markets only to let Tehran keep the one capability that has defined this standoff for years. So both sides are pushed by political gravity toward conflicting public stories. This is where diplomacy becomes dangerous. Some ambiguity can be useful. History is full of agreements that moved forward because both sides accepted vague wording long enough to prevent collapse. But there is a difference between constructive ambiguity and foundational contradiction. If one side believes enrichment is part of the path forward and the other side insists it is categorically off the table, then the deal is not fragile because details still need work. The deal is fragile because its core meaning has not been shared. And the consequences go far beyond the nuclear file. If Iran preserves enrichment, it preserves future leverage. It keeps a bargaining chip that can shape sanctions talks, regional security talks, and the balance of fear across the Middle East for years. If Trump blocks it, he preserves a hard line that satisfies domestic politics but risks detonating the negotiation from within. Either way, this is not a semantic dispute. It is a strategic fault line. So when a phrase vanishes between languages, pay attention. That is often where the real agreement ends and the political performance begins. And in this case, the missing words may be telling us the most important truth of all: this ceasefire may have paused the confrontation, but it has not yet produced a shared definition of what peace even means. What has Trump actually said, and why it does not match Iran's story? What Donald Trump has said about this ceasefire matters just as much as what Iran has claimed, because the gap between those two stories may be the most dangerous thing in the entire negotiation. Tehran is presenting a picture of a framework that moves in Iran's direction. Trump is presenting something very different, a deal still under American control, still under American pressure, and still subject to American interpretation. Those are not minor differences in tone. They are competing descriptions of political reality. Trump has called the proposal workable. He has said that many of the points are very good. He has suggested that a great deal of the substance has already been negotiated. On the surface, that sounds like momentum. It sounds like structure. It sounds like a path toward resolution. But then he shifts. He refers to a broader framework, something closer to a 15-point understanding rather than the 10-point plan promoted by Iranian media. He rejects Iran's claimed right to enrich uranium. He says the United States will talk about sanctions relief and tariffs, but he never fully validates Tehran's account of what has been conceded. And most importantly, he makes clear that American ships, aircraft, personnel, ammunition, and weapons will remain in place in and around Iran until what he calls the real agreement is fully complied with. That phrase is the key. Real agreement. Those two words tell you Trump does not view the current ceasefire as the final deal, and he does not want the world to view it that way either. He is deliberately creating distance between the public pause and the permanent settlement. In plain language, he is saying, this is not peace yet, this is not trust yet, and this is definitely not a moment in which the United States gives up its ability to strike again. That is classic Trump. He wants the optics of progress without surrendering the leverage of uncertainty. He wants to look like the man who forced Iran into a pause, not the man who was dragged into compromise by the rising price of war. He wants to sound flexible enough to calm markets and avoid panic, but hard enough to reassure his political base that he did not fold. In power terms, he is trying to do three things at once: claim victory, preserve coercion, and keep room to rewrite the terms later. And that is exactly why his story does not match Iran's story. Iran needs to show that resistance produced gains. Trump needs to show that pressure produced results. Iran needs strategic dignity. Trump needs visible dominance. Iran talks like the broad principles are already leaning in its favor. Trump talks like the real negotiation is still being conducted on his field, under his terms, with American power still fully loaded in the background. This gap has serious consequences. A ceasefire can survive tension. It can survive mistrust. What it cannot survive for long is a situation where both sides are selling different contracts to their own audiences. Because once those audiences lock into different expectations, compromise becomes politically expensive and future escalation becomes easier to justify. So when Trump speaks, listen less to the celebratory language and more to the structure beneath it. He is not describing a completed peace. He is describing a controlled pause inside an active pressure campaign. And if Tehran believes it is hearing the outline of one future while Washington is preparing another, then the real threat is not misunderstanding at the edges. The real threat is that the ceasefire is being built on two conflicting stories that cannot hold the same weight for very long. Why the Strait of Hormuz is the real battlefield. The Strait of Hormuz is where this entire crisis stops being abstract and becomes brutally real. It is where military pressure turns into economic force. It is where a narrow ribbon of water carries the weight of global energy markets, shipping confidence, consumer prices, and the political survival of leaders far beyond the Middle East. That is why Hormuz is not just part of this story. It is the center of gravity. For many Americans, the phrase sounds distant, technical, almost academic. But the consequences are immediate and intimate. When Hormuz is threatened, oil traders react. When oil traders react, fuel prices move. When fuel prices move, trucking costs rise, airline costs rise, grocery costs rise, and inflation pressure spreads through the economy like heat through metal. A waterway in the Gulf becomes a bill in an American mailbox. That is how power works now. Geography becomes economics, and economics becomes politics. Iran understands this better than anyone. Tehran does not need to defeat the United States in a conventional sense to gain leverage. It only needs to make the cost of disorder too high to ignore. That is what choke point strategy is all about. A weaker power that sits on a critical artery can impose pressure far above its weight. It can make every ship a question mark, every insurer more cautious, every government more nervous, every market more jumpy. That is why Iran's demands around Hormuz matter so much. This is not just about reopening traffic. It is about who gets to manage risk, who gets to extract concessions, and who gets to shape the economic terms of regional order after the shooting slows down. That is also why the current talk of reopening must be treated carefully. A strait that is technically open but strategically unstable is not truly open. If ships face military oversight, mine fears, rerouting uncertainty, or political conditions for passage, then the market does not read that as normal commerce. It reads it as controlled vulnerability. And controlled vulnerability still carries a price. Freight rates remain elevated. Insurance premiums stay tense. Supply chains remain exposed. Investors remain cautious. The flow may resume, but confidence does not magically return. This is where Washington faces a deeper problem than it wants to admit. President Donald Trump can declare progress, but markets do not trade on slogans. They trade on durability. They want to know whether Hormuz is safely navigable, not whether a press statement says diplomacy is advancing. They want proof that the next tanker will move without crisis, the next week will not bring another threat, and the next headline will not reverse the entire mood again. There is also a harder strategic truth here. Control over Hormuz is not only about oil. It is about political timing. If Iran can influence the pace and safety of one of the world's most important energy corridors, then it can influence inflation pressure at exactly the moment U.S. leaders are most vulnerable to it. That gives Tehran a tool that is economic on the surface but political at the core. So yes, missiles matter. Statements matter. Summits matter. But in this crisis, the real battlefield is not where leaders speak. It is where tankers pass. Because if Hormuz remains unstable, then the ceasefire remains incomplete. And if that water stays weaponized, the world will learn once again that in modern conflict, the most powerful battlefield is often the one that looks like a trade route until the day it starts deciding the fate of governments. Lebanon, the side war that can kill the main deal. Lebanon is the test that exposes whether this ceasefire is real or theatrical. It is the side war that can kill the main deal because it strikes at the most dangerous weakness inside the current arrangement. One side believes the conflict is interconnected, while the other is trying to isolate the parts that are politically convenient. That kind of mismatch does not stay contained for long. It eventually tears through the entire structure. Israel has made its position clear. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government says Lebanon is not covered by the ceasefire. The White House has signaled the same basic line, and J.D. Vance has reinforced it publicly. But Iran and Pakistan have pointed in the opposite direction, treating the ceasefire as something broader, something that must include the wider theater if it is going to survive. That contradiction is not just diplomatic static. It is the fault line underneath the negotiation. To understand why this matters, Americans need to look past the map and see the architecture. Hezbollah is not some unrelated side actor from Tehran's point of view. It is part of Iran's regional deterrence network. It is part of the layered structure through which Iran projects influence, absorbs pressure, and warns adversaries that any direct confrontation will spread beyond one border and one battlefield. So if Israel continues striking Hezbollah while Washington says it is pursuing calm with Iran, Tehran can reasonably conclude that the war has not stopped at all. It has simply been reorganized. That is why the Iranian warning was so sharp. The United States, Tehran says, must choose ceasefire or continued war via Israel. That line cuts directly into the heart of American strategy. Because what Washington appears to want is a narrow deal with Iran that freezes the most economically dangerous front while preserving freedom for Israel to keep pressing in Lebanon. On paper, that may look like compartmentalization. In reality, it looks like selective de-escalation designed for one audience and one pressure point, while the broader conflict remains alive. History tells us this is where supposedly promising deals often die. Not at the central table. not in the first handshake. They die on the connected front that leaders try to pretend is separate. Proxy networks do not respect neat diplomatic categories. Militia warfare does not pause because a press office chooses a narrower definition of the conflict. Once one side believes the ceasefire is being used as cover to continue pressure through an ally, trust collapses fast, and retaliation becomes politically easier to justify. There is also a human cost here that cannot be ignored. Lebanon is not an abstract pressure node. It is a country already carrying exhaustion, displacement, fear, and shattered infrastructure. Every new strike deepens the emotional and political charge around the conflict. Every civilian death makes de-escalation harder. Every bombing gives hardliners on all sides more oxygen. And once war produces that kind of moral and emotional gravity, diplomacy starts losing altitude. So Lebanon is not peripheral to this story. It is central. If the ceasefire cannot survive contact with the Lebanon front, then it was never a true ceasefire in strategic terms. It was a temporary arrangement built around one corridor of interest while ignoring the wider chain of fire attached to it. And that is why Lebanon may become the place where this entire deal is judged, not by what leaders promised in public, but by whether the region was actually allowed to stop burning. The hidden drivers: oil, inflation, elections, and the cost of escalation. To understand why this ceasefire happened when it did, you have to look beneath the speeches, beneath the diplomacy, beneath the military choreography, and follow the pressure where it was actually building. The hidden drivers were not just missiles and threats. They were oil, inflation, elections, and the widening cost of escalation. That is how modern power really works. Governments may speak in the language of strength, but they still operate under the discipline of markets and the judgment of voters. President Donald Trump was not making decisions in a vacuum. He was making them inside a tightening political and economic box. As the confrontation with Iran intensified, the risk was no longer limited to the battlefield. It was moving into fuel prices, consumer anxiety, market uncertainty, and the daily financial life of ordinary Americans. That matters because wars in the Middle East do not stay in the Middle East. They travel through energy, and energy travels through everything. The public feels that before it reads any briefing paper. The average American family may not track every statement from Tehran, Islamabad, or Washington, but it notices when gasoline climbs, when food delivery gets more expensive, when flights cost more, when inflation refuses to cool, and when every promise of stability starts sounding hollow. That is where the real cost of escalation lands. Not in abstract grand strategy, but in household psychology. And once that pressure reaches the kitchen table, political time speeds up. This is what many leaders learn too late: oil is not just a commodity. It is a political accelerant. Higher oil prices feed transport costs. Transport costs feed consumer prices. Consumer prices shape inflation expectations. Inflation expectations shape interest rate pressure, market sentiment, wage frustration, and electoral mood. One shock moves into another. A conflict that begins as a foreign policy event becomes a domestic economic burden. That conversion is fast, and it is unforgiving. That is why this ceasefire should also be read as an act of cost control. Trump can present it as a position of dominance, and politically he has every reason to do so. But the deeper reality is that the strategic bill was arriving. Polls were showing unease. The midterm environment was already becoming more dangerous. The longer the confrontation ran, the harder it would become to contain the political damage. And in American politics, inflation is more than an economic problem. It is a trust problem. It tells voters the people in charge are not in control. There is a deeper economic principle here that viewers should understand. Inflation behaves like a tax on instability. No one votes for it, but everyone pays it. It punishes savings, wages, planning, and confidence. And once inflation becomes linked to geopolitical volatility, leaders are forced into a painful contradiction. They escalate to project strength, then they de-escalate because the cost of looking strong becomes too expensive to sustain. Markets were signaling exactly that discomfort. Investors did not respond to the ceasefire with full confidence because they know headlines are not the same as structural stability. They know uncertainty itself is costly. Businesses delay decisions when energy risk remains live. Consumers pull back when price anxiety rises. Capital becomes more cautious when the rules of the game look unstable. So when we ask what really drove this pause, the answer is not mysterious. It was not idealism. It was not sudden trust. It was the collision between geopolitical brinkmanship and economic reality. Trump may speak in the language of victory. But underneath the rhetoric, this was also a move shaped by oil, by inflation, by election pressure, and by the brutal truth that the cost of escalation had started coming home. Europe, Pakistan, China, and the world's quiet message: Trump cannot control the whole board. What this ceasefire revealed was not just the limits of war. It revealed the limits of control. President Donald Trump may still command the largest military machine on earth, but this crisis showed something far more uncomfortable for Washington. America no longer moves alone across an empty board. Other powers are not waiting for instructions. Allies are not simply echoing White House language. Middle powers are no longer acting like background players. And rivals are learning how to shape outcomes without ever standing at the center of the stage. Look first at Europe. European leaders welcomed the ceasefire, but their response was not trust. It was relief mixed with exhaustion. They were not celebrating a grand American success. They were reacting to the temporary suspension of a crisis that had already hit their economies, strained energy systems, destabilized domestic politics, and reminded them how vulnerable they are when Washington moves in sharp, unpredictable swings. That is why the tone from Europe mattered so much. Kaja Kallas called it a step back from the brink. Antonio Costa pushed the language of sustainable peace. Friedrich Merz focused on the need to prevent a wider energy shock. Keir Starmer stressed that enormous work remained. Emmanuel Macron pressed for Lebanon to be included. Pedro Sanchez went even further, refusing to applaud those who set the world on fire simply because they later arrived carrying water. These are not the words of allies reassured by American leadership. These are the words of governments trying to survive its consequences. That shift is deeper than one crisis. It speaks to a wider erosion of confidence. For decades, America's allies often worried about U.S. power, but they also relied on U.S. predictability. That second part is now weakening. Trump's style does not just pressure adversaries. It whipsaws partners. One day it is annihilation rhetoric, the next day a ceasefire, the next day demands for allied support, and then silence when strategic clarity is needed most. That does not make America weak. But it does make America harder to plan around. And when allies cannot plan around Washington, they begin to hedge. Then there is Pakistan. Islamabad did not just appear as a messenger. It emerged as a broker at the exact moment the crisis needed a channel. That matters because it shows the United States could not simply impose the diplomatic outcome by willpower alone. It needed a bridge. It needed a state that could move between camps, absorb urgency, and deliver an emergency opening when direct trust was absent. Pakistan understood the opportunity as well. In a world where influence is often built through crisis access, mediation is power. Islamabad was not just helping contain a war. It was raising its geopolitical value. China's role was quieter, but no less important. Beijing had strong reasons to favor de-escalation. Iran matters to China as an energy partner, a trade node, and a strategic point in the wider contest with the United States. China does not need public ownership of the ceasefire to benefit from it. It only needs enough influence to steer events away from total disorder. That is the modern game. Power is not always loud. Sometimes it works through pressure that leaves no fingerprints. And that brings us to the world's quiet message. Trump cannot control the whole board because the board itself has changed. The United States remains the central military power, but not the sole architect of outcomes. Europe is adapting. Pakistan is maneuvering. China is calculating. And the rest of the world is learning a hard lesson: when Washington becomes more transactional, more volatile, and more emotionally driven in crisis, the global response is not surrender. It is adjustment. This ceasefire did more than pause a war. It exposed a world reorganizing itself around American unpredictability. Final judgment: is this a peace plan, a pressure play, or a countdown to the next rupture? So what is this, in the end? Is Iran's 10-point peace plan the opening chapter of a real settlement? Is it a pressure tactic dressed up as diplomacy? Or is it simply the countdown clock to the next rupture? The honest answer is that, right now, it is all three at once. And that is exactly why this moment is so dangerous. Let's strip away the comforting language. This is not a finished peace. It is not a stable agreement. It is not a shared vision of order. It is a temporary political structure built by actors who still do not trust one another, still do not describe the same terms in the same way, and still have every incentive to preserve their leverage for the next round. That matters, because deals do not fail only when leaders walk away from the table. They also fail when the table itself is built on incompatible assumptions. Iran's 10-point plan should be understood for what it is: a maximal opening bid from a regime that believes pressure has given it bargaining power. Tehran is not negotiating like a defeated state. It is negotiating like a state that thinks it survived the storm, held on to key leverage, and can now demand payment for restraint. President Donald Trump, meanwhile, is not talking like a leader who has accepted a settled framework. He is talking like a man trying to claim victory, calm markets, reassure nervous voters, and keep military pressure available at every stage. Those two positions can coexist for a short time. They cannot coexist forever without collision. That is why this ceasefire feels less like an ending than a suspended test. The real question is not whether the guns have briefly quieted. The real question is whether the core engines of confrontation have been reduced or simply paused. And when you look honestly at the board, the answer is unsettling. The Hormuz question is unresolved. The Lebanon question is still burning. The sanctions question is still loaded with economic and political explosives. The enrichment question remains the deepest fault line of all. The regional force posture has not been fundamentally reset. In other words, the language of diplomacy has advanced faster than the structure of peace. This is where strategic prediction becomes possible. If talks in Islamabad produce a framework both sides can publicly defend without triggering backlash at home, then this pause may harden into something more durable. If Hormuz becomes genuinely stable rather than conditionally usable, markets will begin to breathe again. If Lebanon is pulled into a broader de-escalation logic, one of the most dangerous triggers may be neutralized. But if those things do not happen, then the pause will not mature into peace. It will decay into accusation. And once both sides accuse the other of cheating, lying, or exploiting the truce, escalation becomes easier to sell politically and emotionally. That is the part Americans must not ignore. A distant ceasefire can feel like resolution from far away. But in this case, what looks like calm may actually be compressed instability. And compressed instability is often more dangerous than open crisis, because it creates the illusion that the system is healing while the underlying pressure keeps building. So my final judgment is this: Iran's 10-point peace plan is not the end of the story. It is the document that reveals how unresolved the story still is. This ceasefire bought time, and time matters. But time is not peace. Time is not trust. Time is not strategic settlement. Unless the contradictions underneath this pause are confronted directly, this will not be remembered as the agreement that ended the crisis. It will be remembered as the interval in which all sides prepared their case for why the next explosion was someone else's fault. In the end, this story is not just about Iran, Donald Trump, the Strait of Hormuz, or a 2-week ceasefire balanced on the edge of collapse. It is about how power really works when the cameras are on, when the markets are shaking, and when the world is forced to live inside the gap between public words and private calculations. Iran came to the table not as a broken state, but as a state trying to turn pressure into leverage. Trump spoke not as a man closing a peace, but as a man trying to claim victory while keeping force, ambiguity, and political advantage alive at the same time. Around them stood Europe, Pakistan, China, Israel, and Lebanon, each revealing a larger truth: no modern conflict stays local, and no modern ceasefire is just about stopping bullets. It is about money, energy, fear, credibility, inflation, public trust, and the balance between short-term survival and long-term order. That is why this story matters so deeply. It shows us that the most dangerous moments in history are often not the moments of open explosion, but the moments of uneasy pause, when leaders declare progress while the foundations remain unstable underneath them. The deeper lesson is clear. In politics, in economics, and in life, unresolved pressure does not disappear just because the noise goes down. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is only compressed tension waiting for its next trigger. That lesson applies to all of us. In our own lives, we often mistake temporary calm for true resolution: in family conflict, in financial stress, in work, in relationships, in personal decisions we delay because the crisis seems to have cooled. But if the root issue is still there, if trust is still broken, if incentives are still misaligned, then the problem has not ended. It has only changed shape. The wise response is not to relax too early. It is to look deeper, ask what remains unresolved, and build stability before the next shock arrives. Here is a quick question for you. A. This ceasefire is the beginning of a real peace. B. This ceasefire is only a temporary pause before a bigger crisis. Comment A or B below. And now I want to hear your view. Do you believe Donald Trump has created a real opening for stability, or do you think this entire deal is still too fragile to trust? Share your opinion in the comments so everyone can read, compare, and think through the issue together. And subscribe to the channel to support the work and keep this channel strong for the next deep dive analysis.